on my channel I don't necessarily do violent true crime, and today I'm doing a requested video about the Bling ring. You might have heard about the 2013 movie starring Emma Watson, and I do remember the movie. I didn't watch it, I remember the trailer, and I completely forgot that this was based on real events that we will dive into today. There's also a book by Nancy Jo Sales titled The Bling Ring: How a Gang of Fame-Obsessed Teens Ripped Off Hollywood and Shocked the World. I actually have listened to it a little bit, but it focused a lot on other topics, and it had this 2013 sentiment of all millennials are so narcissistic and social media are just terrible. You know, that was very much the atmosphere at the time. So just if you would pick up that book, just be aware of that. But anyways, let's dive into the actual crimes. And what is interesting is that up until that point, Hollywood didn't really have an organized thief group such as this. So the Bling Ring, also known as Hollywood Hills Burglar Bunch, or the Burglar Bunch, or the Hollywood Hills Burglars, and it was a group of 7 teenagers and young adults. Technically, there were only 5 of teenagers part of the actual Bling Ring, and the other 2 were just resellers. They were based around Calabas, California, and they were active from 2008 to 2009. And in total, they stole about $3 million of cash and other luxurious belongings. Oftentimes they stole these luxury brand items from Gucci, Tiffany, Chanel, Prada, Yves Saint Laurent, Burberry, Dolce & Gabbana, etc., etc. It's reported that they in total broke into apparently 50 homes, but much of the stolen property belonged to Paris Hilton. Okay, at first I will introduce you the members, and then I will talk about their crimes, just so I wouldn't have to introduce people in the middle of the video. Everything started with Rachel Lee and Nick Prugo. Rachel was the alleged ringleader. Honestly, it could have been Rachel or Nick, and she was expelled from Calabas High School, where she actually met another member named Courtney that I didn't talk about yet, and later attended the Indian Hills High School, which was an alternative school that awarded her creative art scholarship. And she was seen as this typical rich girl. She was almost referred to as like the plastics from Mean Girls. If you have seen the movie, she was like the it girl, and she was obsessed with reality TV and celebrities in general. Then we have Nick Prugo, who also went to the Calabas High School, but he transferred to the Indian Hills High School, and that's when he and Rachel became friends. Even though they went to the same school before, they didn't really talk much. And he was a child actor. He had a role as Kenny in 2003 in Little Lost Souls, which was a program about possessed children. And it was like a quasi-TV documentary about the exorcism of children whose parents believed them to be possessed by evil. He was sometimes described as this shy and timid guy, but at the same time, some people described him as being really mean and conniving. And actually, I'll talk about his actions in a bit, so you can decide for yourself. And he, at some point, he started taking drugs, and he would steal to have money for drugs. Then we've got Alexis Nyers and her adoptive sister house we've got Johnny Ajar, who was a former convict, and he's named Johnny Dangerous. And he was recruited by Ames, who at the time was his girlfriend. He first met Ames and her friends in a nightclub titled The Green Door and allowed them to go in even though they were minors at the time. And they used fake IDs. And he was only there to sell the items. He didn't partake in any of the robberies. And also, Courtney Ames recruited Roy Lopez Jr. They had worked together at a restaurant and a bar in Calabas, and she also recruited him as a reseller, but he apparently also participated in a burglary of Paris Hilton. Okay, so those are all the members. We've got 5 of the actual thieves and the 2 resellers, but they never actually, I think, went into the house together. Like, it was always Rachel and Nick, and then someone would just tag along, like Diana and Courtney or Alexis. Okay, so let's go over the burglaries now. At first though, let's talk about Nick's friend, or more like frenemy, Eden. He was only mentioned in the book in 1 sentence, and he actually made a whole video talking about how his house was burglarized by Nick and his ring. And at first, they were kind of, I would say, like frenemies. They argued all the time, but Nick became really obsessed with Eden. And then Eden posted on MySpace that his family is going on a vacation. And so Nick and Rachel went into the house and they stole about $8,000 worth of cash. And later on they even came back and someone was actually in the house at the time, but they stole a laptop that belonged to Eden as well. And Eden, or more like his parents, never got the money back, by the way. Then Nick and Rachel would just go around and they would check cars to see if they were open. And they were sometimes, and they would take the credit cards that were in them as well, and they would just go shopping with the fake credit cards, and no one would really question them. I guess they looked the part. They were just a bunch of teenagers that were dressed nicely. Then Rachel and Diana DeMeo were charged for petty theft because they stole $85 worth of merchandise at Sephora. And then they have met Johnny Dangerous, and at that point Rachel thought that it would be a really good idea to go to celebrities' homes and steal from them. For whatever reason, I guess she liked their clothes, or she was kind of obsessed with them. And so her and Nick, I think Nick was the brain of the operation. Nick would look at aerial photos of celebrity homes and they would determine where should they go into the house. And their first victim was supposed to be Paris Hilton because she was seen as dumb. And they believed that perhaps she would keep her house unlocked. And so they went into their house, they rang the doorbell a couple of times, and then they found a key under the rug, a spare key, but they didn't really need it because turns out the house was actually unlocked. And so they went in, they stole a bunch of luxury items, but then they got kind of confident with it and they have returned at least 3 more times. And Rachel even put the key under the rug on her keychain, and Paris would just replace it. And Paris didn't really notice she was being robbed. At some point they not only started to some topless pictures, so they took them and they wanted to sell them to the media, which not really ended up happening, I think. They even took some alcohol and they got really confident with it. They were bragging about it all the time. And once they went in, there was Nick, Rachel, Courtney, and Roy Lopez Jr., and they stole $2 million worth of jewelry and a Louis Vuitton duffel bag. They just took this bag from Paris and just filled it with jewelry. And of course, that was a lot of items, and Paris noticed it, and she has reported it to the police. After it was on the news, they moved to their next target, which was Audrina Partridge. This was in February 2009, and they again went in through unlocked doors. They took some jewelry, her passport, her laptop computer, and also jeans that were custom fit just for her. And the value of the items was around $43,000. Rachel Lee and Nick Brugo were recorded on the Patriots surveillance videos, and she posted the pictures of them online on her website, and then it was picked up by a lot of media outlets, but still no one recognized them. After a month, the buzz around that would just die down, and they would actually get away with it if they didn't continue. But they moved to a next target, which was Rachel Bilson. I think that only Nick, Rachel, and Diana partook in this specific robbery, but the details around that are kind of foggy. They burglarized her home 3 to 6 times during April and May 2009, and the amount of stolen property was between $130,000 to $300,000. They took designer items, shoes, makeup, jewelry, Rachel Bilson's mother's engagement ring, and it's clear that they became more and more confident. At first they were just very clean, they would clean up after themselves, but at this point they just didn't care. They left a mess around, they took a lot of stuff as well, so it was very noticeable. And Rachel Lee even used Bilson's bathroom to take a dump, and apparently it was extremely smelly. That's how comfortable they were with these robberies. And they were able to make a few $1,000s from the reselling of the items. Then they moved to a next target, which was Orlando Bloom and his girlfriend, then they moved to a next target, which was Orlando Bloom and his live-in girlfriend at the time, Miranda Kerr. And they chose specifically Miranda because Rachel liked her clothes and her underwear, apparently. This time we've had Nick Brugo, Alexis Nyers, Rachel Lee, and Diana Tamayo, and they apparently cut a hole through the fence, and then they waited until they could enter the premises, and they stole a large amount of high fashion clothing, as well as Bloom's vintage Rolex watch collection, Louis Vuitton luggage, and also some artworks, because at the time Rachel Lee was supposed to move to Las Vegas to her father, and so she wanted the Bloom's art to decorate her place with. And Alexis Nyers, who claimed that she went there unknowingly, was high on heroin at the time, and she had to vomit in the garden as well, and she urinated in the bushes, which is like a TMI, I guess. I guess you didn't really have to know that, right? And the items that they stole was worth $500,000. Then they moved to their next target, which was Brian Austin Green and Megan Fox, who was his wife at the time. And that's because, again, Rachel Lee liked the clothes of Megan Fox. And when they went inside the house, the group also found the Green's gun, 6-Sauer .38 semi-automatic handgun, and they took it with them as well. And then their last victim was Lindsay Lohan, who Rachel Lee admired, and at the time she was already living with her father in Las Vegas, but she returned to LA for this burglary. Lindsay Lohan was Lee's ultimate fashion icon and biggest conquest, and this time it was Rachel Lee, Nick Brugo, and Diana Tamayo, and they allegedly stole around $130,000 worth of clothes and jewelry from Lohan's home. At the time, these burglaries became very heavily publicized, and then an anonymous tipster informed the police that it was actually Rachel Lee and Nick Brugo that were responsible for these robberies. We don't know till this day who it was, but to be honest, the whole Bling ring would always brag about these robberies. They wore these stolen items, they took pictures with it, so it truly could have been anyone. Nick Brugo's face was captured on the surveillance, and he went to the police. At first, he didn't confess anything, but he claimed that due to high anxiety, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, his hair was falling out, and so he admitted to everything. He told the police about all the burglaries. The police didn't even know about all of them at that point, and he also said that the ring was still researching other potential targets such as Miley Cyrus, Zac Efron, Hilary Duff, and Vanessa Hudgens, and he said all of this without getting any plea deal for some reason. 2 weeks after Nick Brugo's confessions, search warrants for the other members of the ring were issued by the LAPD. So now let's talk about how this went down and where are these ring members now. So for Rachel Lee, she actually asked the police very hypothetical questions if it might help her if she knew where these stolen items are, because at the time she thought that she didn't have any of the stolen items in her possession. But they found a coat that was definitely belonging to Lindsay Lohan, and they also found a topless picture of Paris Hilton in her home. And at that point she became very sick. She started to gag and she almost turned hysterical. Rachel Lee was sentenced in October 2011. She pled no contest and she was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but she only served a year and 4 months, and then she was released on parole. And she said that prison was a blessing in disguise. And later on she graduated cosmetology school, and now she's writing television screenplays. Nick Brugo also pleaded no contest, and he was sentenced in 2013 to 2 years in prison, but he received credit for a year of time he already served, and he was later credited with a year for good behavior and work time. And he was arrested again in 2015 for stalking a Hollywood esthetician. Apparently they were friends, but when the friendship went sour, Nick started to harass her and stalk her, and he has committed other crimes against her. Let's talk about Alexis Nyers, who became almost like a face of the group because she was the most famous one. She had her own reality show, and at first she denied any involvement in the burglaries. And there's this quote that I have to read you guys in full, so pay attention because I think it's so, I don't even know what to call it. Let me just read it to you. I'm a firm believer in karma, and I think this situation was attracted into my life because it was supposed to be a huge learning lesson for me to grow and expand as a spiritual human being. I see myself being like an Angelina Jolie, but even stronger, pushing even harder for the universe and for peace and for the health of our planet. God didn't give me these talents and looks to just sit around being a model or she also pled no contest to the residential burglary. She was sentenced in 2010 to a jail term of 180 days with additional 3 years of probation and was ordered to pay $600,000 worth of restitution to the actor. When she was at the Century Regional Detention Facility, she occupied the same cell block as Lindsay Lohan, but they never spoke to each other. And after serving 30 days of her sentence, she was released. Then she was arrested again for possession of heroin in 2010, but she was allowed to live in a luxury rehab facility in Malibu for a year, and she was staying there free of charge thanks to the facility's owner. And she says that she has been sober from drugs ever since. She became an anti-drug advocate. She also became a certified doula. She has a podcast titled Recovering from Reality, and she got married to a Canadian businessman, but they actually announced their separation this year in April 2022. Then let's move on to Diana Tamayo. She also pled no contest, and she was sentenced to 3 years of probation and 60 days of community service, and she was threatened with immigration consequences to get her to admit all these crimes. Now she's working as a personal trainer, and she claimed that her relationship to God changed her life. Courtney Ames actually got the exact same sentence, 3 years of probation and 2 months of community service. And later on she enrolled in college where she studied psychology, speech and child development. Then we've got the 2 resellers. At first we've got Johnny Dangerous Ajar, who was initially faced with 10 felony charges, 6 counts of possession for sale of a controlled substance, 3 counts of possession of a firearm by a felon, and 1 count of possession of ammunition. He was the one who had the Brian Austin Green's gun and also Orlando Bloom's expensive Rolex watch, and he was sentenced to 3 years in jail and was released less than a year later in March 2011, and then he was reported to be back in jail in 2013. Then we also have Roy Lopez Jr. He pled no contest for stealing over $2 million worth of jewelry from Paris Hilton, and he was given 3 years of probation and credited for 100 days he already served in jail. And then he reportedly left California to go to Texas. So that's it really. So all of these events inspired the 2013 Bling Ring movie, which was a satirical crime film written and directed by Sofia Coppola. It's actually based on 2010 Vanity Fair article The Suspects Wore Louboutins, and it was written by Nancy Jo Sales. And there's this famous scene from Alexis Nayer's reality TV show. You can watch it if you want to. It's a little funny, I must say, even though apparently the reporter lied to Alexis because she promised that she would portray her in a nice light, but that ended up just not happening. And there's a famous phone call. You can watch it if you want to. I will link it down below. And also one last piece of information is that the detective Brett Goodkin, who was a chief investigator in the case, was approached by the movie makers to play himself in the movie, and he took the role, but allegedly he wasn't granted permission from his superiors to work on the film, and that actually led him to be investigated later on. So that's it. That's the case. What do you think? It's definitely interesting. One thing that I haven't really noticed anyone mentioning is that I think at first it was truly about the luxurious items, just wanted to live like a socialite kind of life, but later on I think that it became much more than that, and I think that later on it just was about violating these famous people's privacies and making as much mess as possible. And at some point I think that it was mainly about power, the power to go into these homes and to leave unnoticed and to invade the privacy of these celebrities. So, do you think that they should have served more time in prison? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.